Welcome to another episode of Power of the Mind, where we give you simple tools to help you improve your relationship with yourself and with others. Today we're going to talk a lot about recovering from infidelity. It's a really interesting episode where we go into some of the motivations for infidelity. We talk about polyamorous relationships and how those do and sometimes do not work, and talk about some options for moving through infidelity if a person decides they want to do that. It's a really interesting episode. Stay tuned.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Power of the Mind, presented by Granite Mountain Behavioral Healthcare. With me, as always, Greg Struve.
Hi.
And our research gal, Marilee Mills.
Hi.
How's it going?
Good.
So you jumped on awfully quick with a hot topic. What do you want to talk about?
I want to talk about infidelity, affairs, and the culture almost of cheating and acceptable cheating.
So just to let's give some background. So you've been married how long?
I've been married a little over a year.
And you're currently
very pregnant.
Very pregnant with twins.
With twins, yes.
I've been married 32 and a half years, and
you have 5 kids.
I've been married 15 years.
There you go.
You
You
have
have 2?
I have 2
32.
kids. Yeah.
Also twins.
Also twins.
Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't do twins. I just did 5 of them, all
Slacker.
separate. So
I try to be efficient.
yeah, that's
We know you're a stalker.
might have been a little easier to carry them all at one time, but
Although, who am I kidding? I didn't do much.
like you've
It's
got
a little
this.
harder on this side, at least right now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I wanted to kind of preface like where we're all coming from. So 32 years, newlywed, 15. We're all about very different stages
Yeah, we are in different stages, aren't we?
of the marriage cycle.
But I call them, at this point, successful relationships.
Fair enough.
I mean, that's for us all to judge, but I call mine successful.
Honestly, as somebody who's been married 32 years, and I bet you that Greg would back me up, I would not want to go through that first year of marriage again. I mean, it's awesome. The first year, like everybody, we love each other, but it's tough. It's work.
It's been really easy.
It gets better after about 10 years, I'd say.
Okay, good. So 9 more to go.
I think
Well, 8 and counting. 8 and
There
some
you go.
change.
Yeah, nothing to it.
No.
I think the first year is probably the easiest of the newlywed stage because it's all very new. I think year 2 is when we went, oh, what was I thinking? And then we fixed it. But
I'll let you know.
yeah,
We'll have newborns, so I don't know if we'll have time to think that much about it.
2 of them at that.
Yeah.
yeah,
We won't be thinking about it. I'm just kidding.
yeah. We
will.
had 3 by 2 years into our marriage, so yeah, we liked each other. so infidelity.
Yes.
What do you want to talk about? Why?
Well, I'm younger than you guys. I mean,
Yes.
yes,
It's
I'm
true.
sorry. So I'm kind of curious on the culture of infidelity because with people in my age group, it tends to be a little bit more open to a certain extent, at least in my experience. For example, I was out this weekend at a bachelorette party and 2 of the gals were married out of 4 of us, and they took off their wedding rings and engagement rings to go to the bar to flirt and get hit on by men. Not necessarily to do anything physical, but to me, personally, and I know it's a choice that everyone makes, that's infidelity in my brain. Because you're making that choice to have yourself open outside of your relationship. And so I think there's a huge spectrum, but to them, that was obviously not infidelity. They were totally open to that, and they're like, yeah, this is something we do every weekend. And by all accounts, I mean, I didn't ask their husbands, but I assumed it was okay with their husbands as well.
Sure.
And so kind of the spectrum to that, to obviously full-blown affairs and second families and more physical things.
that to me feels like just throwing some gasoline on a fire. What do you think?
Oh, man, I don't know. I mean, it depends on the individual. Infidelity, the definition of infidelity within the context of a relationship, more or less, you have 2 definitions. One is the definition that's supplied by the culture, which has shifted pretty dramatically in the last 10 years or so. And from a counseling perspective, infidelity is about acting in ways that create a sense of betrayal in your partner, that the 2 of you sort of agree are not appropriate, and you do it anyway. You can have sexual infidelity. That's the most commonly considered form. But financial infidelity is an example. I had a client one time who had taken out a second mortgage on his house and lost all the money gambling. So wife was pretty confident they had $300,000 or $400,000 in equity that they had accumulated over many, many years. And then the bank came and took the house away. So that's a similar level of betrayal to what an affair might be, for example. And in terms of infidelity, taking off my wedding ring and getting hit on at the bar, again, that's probably something for the couple to decide. I wouldn't be particularly excited about it in my marriage, and I don't know that I'd engage in the behavior just because, where there's smoke, there's fire, and I don't want to be tempted in that way.
Lines get blurry.
Yeah, exactly. So
one step
there's a risk in that situation. And so for me, I think to expose myself to that kind of opportunity is probably not great.
Yeah.
Although I am, like you mentioned earlier, a bit older than you, so I'm not sure what would happen if I took off my wedding ring at the bar. I'm not super confident I would have that problem to deal with, if I'm
age
honest.
was not a problem for people.
Right.
Yeah, I think you'd still be okay.
Sir,
Probably
you
different.
dropped her wedding ring.
Yeah,
I'm gonna
probably
put that back on.
a little different for a younger
Yeah.
gal too than it is for me. But
That's true.
yeah,
I did ask kind of my husband about it too, to gauge where he was on it, because I was not mortified, but like a little. I lost a little respect for them because that's something that I'm not comfortable with in my relationship.
Yeah.
And he had the same response, which, first of all, great that we're on the same page, right?
Yeah.
Like, we're doing well. But he just kind of was like, I don't know if that's a marriage anymore. Like, and we kind of opened up that discussion of that betrayal, and everyone can set their own boundaries, but to both of us, that why be married? Why have that relationship if you're looking for a different relationship with other partners outside of that, to whatever degree? So that was kind of interesting.
Yeah, there's been a lot. Your generation especially is pretty excited about polyamory and things of that nature. I tend to be pretty conservative sexually because of my experience clinically. I think I've worked with folks who are polyamorous, and I can remember one situation where it made the marriage work. One of the two of them was probably compulsive sexually, and I doubt that there was, without a lot of really challenging work. Most people who are addicted to sex, they won't stop what they're doing. It's pretty rare for any addict, but particularly behavioral addiction, it takes quite a bit of consequences for them to stop doing what they're doing. And in this marriage, the partner who was acting out, I don't think was particularly open or available to the depth and sort of severity of the work she would have to do on herself and the truths she would have to embrace in order to get recovery. And so they opted to engage in a polyamorous relationship. And I would say it probably saved the marriage. Now, the biggest challenge that comes up for me as I talk to folks about that are, one, you're really entering into a layer of complexity. It's actually really complicated to be married to one person. And if you go into Barnes & Noble, the biggest section in Barnes & Noble, now this might not be the case anymore, actually. It's been about 10 years since I've been to a Barnes & Noble, but for a long time, the biggest section in Barnes & Noble was the section on relationships. There's a couple rows of books, all kinds of books. And that's just the ones that make it to Barnes & Noble. There's lots and lots of material on relationships. And the reason there's lots and lots of material on relationships is they're really frickin' hard. There's a lot of pain in relationships. So one of the things that I've seen happen in polyamorous relationships is there's another layer of complexity because you have another individual involved. Then the other thing is the theory underneath them is that, hey, if it's okay with you and it's okay with me, then who are we hurting? Well, that's an easy idea to try. However, in practice, the act of sex is the closest the two people can come to each other physically. And it plays on the attachment system in ways that we don't totally understand. And there's a connection piece to sex a lot of the time that, sex involves all the senses, and it tends to involve many different parts of the psyche at one time in ways. Basically, sex is a little bit more powerful than we like to give it credit for, is my experience with it. And as a result, it's really, really hard for people not to get attached. And so let's say in theory we decide to look at the merit of having a polyamorous relationship. Well, I'm okay with it and you're okay with it. And the underlying theory behind it is that you're going to share everything that happens with me and I'll share everything that happens with you. And as a result, we'll be the primary attachment figure for each other. That's the basic gist of how to make a polyamorous relationship work. Because we're totally honest, and you're the only one who knows all about what's happening, and I'm the only one who knows all about what's happening with you, then that's going to work. The problem is, it's really hard to sleep with a lot of people and not do harm.
Yeah.
That's been my observation. It's really difficult to engage in sex with people. Even if I have a discussion and say, I'm in this relationship and this is my primary person and you are my secondary person, most people cognitively, maybe they can do that, but a lot of people really can't do it emotionally. And so even in this one particular relationship I'm thinking of that I was bringing up as an example earlier, there was a lot of harm done to the people outside of the intimate relationship. There were a lot of folks involved in that situation who suffered. And that's, I think, a really important point to consider that doesn't get put into consideration a lot of the time. Even if I am able to set aside my own insecurities and fear around my partner engaging in sexual behavior outside the relationship, and my partner is able to do the same, it's unlikely that our partners, right? Now we've already even the sentence is pretty complicated,
Yeah.
right? Let alone what happens at home.
Yeah.
It's unlikely that our partners are going to be able to do that.
Yeah.
So I think that's been my experience with polyamory and people trying to make that work.
Having more open than traditional relationships.
And it's the same way, there are different levels. We talk about levels of infidelity. There are some folks who are totally okay with porn, for example. Well, the research on porn is pretty clear. When it's used outside of the relationship, it tends to diminish the relationship, often considerably. And there's some theory that has to do with a thing called oxytocin. There's a neurotransmitter called oxytocin that gets released during an orgasm. And it's designed to bond you with whatever you happen to be looking at the time, more or less. There's more subtlety to understanding it than that, but that's the best understanding. That's the gist of it. And if you have oxytocin with hundreds and hundreds of two-dimensional figures being released, it doesn't bond you as effectively to your primary person. And often the people that we are with do not look like or behave like the people who are engaging in pornography.
What?
Well, that's what I've heard.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's what I've.
I don't know about you guys.
Oh, Clay.
Yeah, that's a different podcast.
Yeah.
I think.
Sorry.
Whatever.
Sorry.
I think it's hysterical. The idea is like, you have a lot of impotence that's related to or failure to perform sexually, because porn actually, I think 30% now of people who consume pornography are women. So it's not the balance that used to be there is not there anymore.
Where it's almost all men.
Yeah, it was very, very predominantly men, and now particularly in the younger generation, there's a much more, much larger demographic of females who are utilizing pornography. But now there is Esther Perel is the one who's responsible for a lot of the talk about polyamory and about the use of pornography. Now her research indicates that utilizing pornography as a couple together seems to be, at least not damaging. She would argue helpful. Okay, so there's that.
Depends on the help you're looking for.
Again, there's that.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, we still get back to this idea, like the research is really, really clear. And the really sad thing is the APA, which is the folks who decide what goes in the diagnostic and statistic manual that we use for counseling, basically decide what gets to be a diagnosis and therefore what gets to receive research funding, won't do anything with sex addiction. And the research on it is gambling addiction got in the last edition. Okay. And gambling and sex addiction have very similar neuronal patterns. Okay. And it's just so, even if it was only pornography addiction, it's so blindingly clear what it is, but everybody's afraid they'll offend somebody or hurt somebody's sensibilities. And so we can't, Lord help us if we talk about the fact that sex is very, very compulsive for some folks.
Wow.
Yeah.
I mean, I look at it a couple ways, being, the old lady on the panel who's been married forever. For me, it was, I get the idea, because I've seen, you see the movies or whatever, where it's like, you'll go to, I want to date like Chippendales or something. And it's like, well, I don't care if you go to that, or I don't care if you go to a strip club as long as you come home to me. That was the that was kind of the saying back in, my day. Well, it's not cheating. He's just, at a strip club or something.
Just looking.
But that whole thing of let's spice up our marriage and let's try this, that is where I think it gets dangerous, because it's, you talk about, we'll bring in a third person or we'll do something like that. And I knew somebody who did that in their marriage, and it was just, we're going to go have a weekend, we're going to do this. And I was telling her, I'm like, I don't think this is a good idea. I don't think it's a good idea. And it was a, female that they were going to bring in. And I said, I just don't think it's a good idea. I'm jealous. Like if I saw, my husband look at somebody the way that is reserved for me, I can't, I could not watch, I couldn't see that. And they ended up divorcing after that weekend. It was like they had marriage problems for a very long time and then they ended up ruining their marriage. But it was, and it may have started with take off your ring and just, flirt or whatever. And then it gets to, well, let's try this or whatever. And at what boundary do you push to where it's too far?
Yeah.
Because for them, she saw something that she didn't want to see, and you just keep replaying that in your mind, and she couldn't get past it. So it was that for her. Where I do start feeling sympathetic for a cheater would be, I think as a mom, early in our marriage, I was very much a mom.
Actually, the first year after the baby arrives is statistically the most likely time for infidelity to show up in the relationship. Yeah. John Gottman and his wife do wonderful, wonderful research. If you're listening and you're nerdy and you want to learn a lot about this, the Gottmans have a library of books they've published over the last 30 years, and everything is so good. GottmanConnect.com, I think, is their website. It's really worth looking at. But carry on. Sorry to interrupt.
No, it was that for me was the time when, you're a mom and you're focused on your kids, and especially, maybe not especially, but I was a working mom. We had 5 kids. It was a long commute to get to work, long commute to get home. And then, of course, I coached cheer at the time. And, and my husband was just a character in my world, so he was like that secondary guy that was just kind of, he's there, he's dad, hold down the fort, but he was no longer my husband. I was a mom, and that was the focus of I lived everything for the kids, the being at their games, coaching them, doing everything with them. And there was a point very early on in our marriage where my husband was like, dude, I'm a guy, like I have needs and we've got to figure this out. And I think for some, and maybe it wasn't even a sexual thing, it was more of a, like, I need attention, like I need to be important in your world. And I think that's probably not, I know it's not the only reason guys cheat, but I think a lot of women have to take that responsibility of knowing that even though they've got these children, they have to nurture their husband as well. And that might sound silly, but it's like they need attention as well. And, maybe not even, like I said, not 100% sexual, but let them know they're important, or let them know, because I think that's what will drive a man away. Maybe not away from the family, but away from you for a bit, is just the lack of attention and the lack of nurturing. Not that it's okay, but I think there's a responsibility that needs, or vice versa.
Well, you bring up a really interesting point. So one of the things that will happen in couples counseling is a couple will come in. Sometimes people will ask me, and I think you mentioned this off the air earlier, can a couple recover from infidelity? And yeah, absolutely. It depends. There's different causes for infidelity, and the cause is really important. I had a graduate school professor, and he said, when you're seeing a couple for infidelity, the first question to ask is, okay, guys, how did you two decide who was going to have the affair? And he said 85% of the time they'll answer the question. Oh, well, she's got the higher libido, so she did. And he said they won't even notice that they're doing it. They'll answer the question. And I was like, wow. Whoa. And his point was, what he was teaching us at the time was, when there is infidelity in a relationship, there's one of two reasons. One, somebody is addicted to sex. And if that's the case, there's a certain line of treatment attached to that. And the other one is there's been a rupture in the marriage. It's been there a while, okay? And somebody's going to somebody's going to sort of take things to the next level. Like the marriage is broken, it's been broken, it's not getting better, and somebody's going to move it in a different direction. Yeah. And he said if it's the addiction thing, And the person who's addicted to sex wants to get better. The marriage can be helped. And if they don't, it can't, generally. And if it's the latter, the marriage is almost always able to get better if both parties are willing to own their part. And that's not to say that the one who is committing the infidelity doesn't have more of a part to own. They absolutely do. But generally speaking, there are some challenges in the marriage that have come up related to both parts. And so when there's willingness to own it and shift on both sides, there's a possibility for reconciliation.
Yeah, like with you talking about kind of like, yes, in your example, the man did cheat. Yes, he's finding physicality somewhere else, but there's also a little bit responsibility in the woman that was part of their marriage and now it's not. So there is a lack in the relationship. And would that kind of fall into that in a way? Well,
it's interesting because in the example Alicia gave, the couple had a conversation, made a decision together, and then based on the story Alicia is telling us, that decision, kind of corrupted the marriage in a way that it couldn't go back from. I'd be really interested to find out, what prompted the discussion and kind of where things went. But the challenge there, of course, is it'd be very challenging for us to have a discussion, come to a conclusion together that everything would be okay, and then turns out it wasn't. So that's a little different than sort of a traditional affair where somebody engages in a sexual relationship without the consent, knowledge, or permission of their spouse. That's probably more what I'm talking about. That situation with Alicia, I think, is pretty unique and challenging. It does remind me, when we're working with people who are related to sex addicts or in relationship with sex addicts, and they discover or uncover the material, they'll often go into a phase where they question their spouse and uncover as much detail as they can. And then the detail really works like a PTSD response, where there are invasive thoughts that come in and are uncontrollable. And you have somebody, it's very similar to uncovering a body or something like, just or a car accident where it replays again without permission. It has an obsessive quality to it. And so one thing I do when I'm working with folks, who are going to disclose some of their betrayals in the relationship, as I say, well, and this is common practice in that part of the field, but when you're talking about what happened, we can disclose it, but we do it in a very sort of systematic, matter of fact, here's the data. On about this date, I had sex with this person. The end. Well, what were you wearing? What were they wearing? Where were you? All these details. Say, well, if I share that with you, it'll create a picture for you. And if it creates a picture for you, that picture will be there for a long, long time. Usually it's a 1 or 2 year process, is my experience in the context of infidelity. Because I've worked with actually quite a few couples who've come through infidelity. And the spouse generally goes through a year or 2 where these invasive thoughts show up. It's pretty rough.
Yeah. I'm surprised it's only a year or 2. I'd hold on to something like that forever.
They definitely, it definitely is relatively permanent. It's uncontrollable for a year or 2.
Okay.
Right. So it's a year where it comes up on its own, so to speak.
And if a relationship ends because of infidelity, as quite a few do, we all know, does that person that was, I guess, the victim that got cheated on, do they carry that into new relationships as well? And can that kind of rear its ugly head throughout?
Oh, sure. Some do, things? Some don't, I suppose. It just depends on their disposition and whether they think, the degree to which they blame themselves, the degree to which they blame, all men or all women in particular. That can be a lot of factors that play into that part. It's not uncommon, for example, if I have a really difficult breakup, to pick somebody who seems very different than the person I was just with.
Extreme opposite.
Right. Because you want to make sure it's not going to happen again.
That obviously didn't work, so let me go the other way.
And what you'll often find is, I had an old friend who used to say, well, you marry one and become the other. And a lot of times you'll find that you have a person who has a lot of characteristics similar to one of your parents. And you say, well, that didn't work. I'm going to do somebody completely different this time. I'm going to pick a completely different partner. And it turns out, awful lot of resemblance to the other parent. So that's a pretty common
Definitely
experience.
have a type, right?
I think we talked a little bit about that in the family dynamics set.
Yeah, we did.
And picking someone that relates to your parents, which is scary.
Yeah.
Well, for some of us.
So yeah, the infidelity element of things, the depth of the betrayal is really challenging for a couple of reasons. One, it was a betrayal and it was really hard. Two, I ask myself the question, do I see the world? My worldview in a long-term relationship, my partner is part of the context and the content. But the context is when I go home, this person will be there and he or she will be more or less who they were when I left. And that's going to be how it is from day to day to day. And now I have a problem because not only am I wrong, I was wrong. And I was wrong maybe for a long, long time. And so I really have to rethink not only like my view of this person, but my view of myself. How good a judge of character am I? And why did I turn a blind eye if I did? Why did I? Because people who cheat, sometimes they're really, really smart or they really have a way about them, but often the spouse does have an intuitive knowledge or some idea that something's going on before it happens, before the discovery happens. Okay, well, why didn't I listen to that? Yeah. And then how much of that's paranoia and my own insecurity and how much of it is my own intuition and my own reality? And then I have to contend with that in my future relationships, not just with intimate relationships, but with the rest of the world too. There's a lot to it. It means it's a big deal. It's a big sandwich. To be betrayed. Yeah.
There's a lot of layers.
And that's part of why a lot of people in your generation, it's really interesting, have just decided to forego the whole relationship marriage thing.
Yes. Yeah. Which we also talked about in the previous episode a little bit.
Yeah. It's just an interesting phenomenon to decide to let it go. I work with some young people and they're just terrified of hurting someone's feelings. They're just absolutely, what if I commit and decide I don't like you? And I say, you'll break up. That's what people do. Yes, but I'll hurt their feelings. Yes.
Okay.
That's what happens.
Eventually.
Yeah.
There's a bunch of movies about heartbreaks. We'll be okay.
Yeah. I mean, it's, and I think it's interesting because we lose the opportunity to have a relationship of real depth. And we lose the opportunity to both know each other and to be known. There are parts of me you guys will never see because if you were, you wouldn't hang out with me anymore. Like there is stuff I'll show my spouse that I would never show a friend because they wouldn't be my friend anymore. And I don't see those parts of myself unless I'm in an intimate long-term relationship. I don't see my ugliest pieces. Even in therapy, I tell my clients this all the time. I say, look, there's stuff that's going to come up in your intimate relationship that we can never bring out here. We can bring out a lot of it, but there is some of it that only comes up in that setting. And the hardest part of it all is to own it for yourself and not blame your spouse for bringing it out. But there's a lot to be learned in life from the difficulty of marriage. And that's the challenge. People say, well, I don't know, every time I look at this marriage thing, looks like it's really hard. And I say, it is hard. It's the hardest thing you've ever done. And think of anything you've been proud of that hasn't been hard. You know, you proud of yourself for getting an ice cream cone? Oh, I'm so proud of myself for walking up to the Dairy Queen. No, you're not, because it's easy. You're not proud of yourself for getting McDonald's. We just finished a couple episodes on weight loss, so I probably don't need to use a food metaphor.
Stop talking about McDonald's.
But things that are and that's the other thing is you have a generation of people who feel empty and don't know why. Man, I don't know what's wrong. I just kind of feel off. Oh, okay.
Forge a relationship.
Do hard things.
Well, that's the thing too. It's like how much of the younger generation is like, ugh, getting a job, that's gonna be hard. I don't want to do that. And I've got to work when to when.
I'll be interested
to see. How many days a week?
Yeah.
I don't know. I'll be really interested to see how jacked up things turn out to actually be. When I remember when I was in my 15 to 20-year-old self listening to my dad, 40 to 45, talk about the woes of the world. And now that's me. Right, I hear myself sometimes like, these kids and all this, they don't work and everything's gonna blah blah. And I think, you know what?
Sorry,
things didn't necessarily. I mean, it might not be better than it was, but it doesn't seem like it really collapsed. Maybe everything, because everybody's, we're all crazy when we're kids, and then maybe when we get older, we change our mind and go back to some of the.
Yeah, when people my age are 40, what are we gonna be like?
It'll be interesting.
I don't know.
You're a mess. It's gonna be a mess.
I'm already a mess.
Yeah, fidelity would be one that was, I know it would be a deal breaker for my husband.
Mm-hmm.
I think for me, it would be I think I'm pretty analytical, and it would be
Mm-hmm.
more of okay, was this a one night stand? Did something happen? And it was
Mm-hmm.
just like, I don't even know. I was drinking and this happened. Could I forgive that? I would be able to forgive that quicker than, well, we've been dating about a year, and every time I told you I was going here, I was really over there. And I could never, never could forgive that. But
Yeah.
I was, when you've been in the trenches for 32 years, it's like, all right,
You see
can I
some
get
things.
past that? Well, it's been relatively steady, but it's like, I don't know. I would have a hard time. And we lived in a apartment complex early on in our marriage. And like, I was the only woman that worked. Like everybody else was just on some sort of outside income. And they would flirt with my husband all the time because it was in Oregon. And it was winter. So, and in construction, it was very hard for him to find work. So I was working and I was the one doing that. And he was home with the 3 kids, which God bless you. I didn't want to do that. Love my children, but didn't want to be home every day all the time. But I would tell him, because all the women, oh, Frega, I'd be like, just so you know, if you ever did anything with any of these women, I would know about it before I even got to the front door. Somebody would make sure that they cracked the facade, or they, gave you that bit of bad news. I don't want to be the one to tell you, but, because that's, women are that way. And so luckily nothing with that, and I know would never think anything happened, but it was, can you come over and fix my this? Like, but, I trust him 100%, but it was one of those things where I don't know how I would get past it. And the people who can, I think I would have to reason that there's probably children involved and there's things we have to do for the kids. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know if there's one answer or one blanket to it, or just completely dependent.
Definitely not. But again, as a general rule, if we work to get over it, the easiest way to get over it, I really have to be able to see and own the part that I played in it.
Okay.
Right? I mean, that's the, again, if there's a sex addiction, it's a different story.
Right.
But if there is an affair in a marriage, it is very rarely
one-sided.
One person. There's an affair. The sex life of the marriage is a mirror of the marriage more often than not. And if people are starting to move a different direction, that things have probably been rough for a long, long time. And the reality of it is, sometimes I just needed to have spoken up about something years and years ago. Right? I make a little compromise here, a little compromise there. I quietly don't forgive, or I don't create a conflict. That actually happens a lot of the time. I decide I'm okay with this, but I'm gonna be passive aggressive about it. I decide not to be sexually available for one reason or another, and it happens on both sides too. It is more common on the male side than the female side to be aggressively interested in sex, and in those situations, it's definitely. But it does go both ways. It can absolutely go both ways, and that's the reality. Is my experience with affairs and with betrayal and infidelity of all kinds is it always starts with a very small lie that I let go. It always starts with some sort of small deception of myself, some sort of willingness to let something slide, to let a hard conversation go, and not to be serious about it. Not to fight for what matters and for what you value.
Wow.
So learning to argue effectively in a relationship and to fight, learning how to fight, I think is extremely important and helpful. So
I brought up a book in one of our podcasts before, and I read it.
I remember you bringing this up.
Like 10 years into my marriage, I read it, and it was the same.
What was her name? Laura
Schlesinger, Proper Care and Feeding of Marriage.
And it's funny.
But it was definitely if he's not hungry, he's horny. If he's not horny, he's hungry. So either cook him a sandwich or.
I bet this was in Barnes & Noble.
It absolutely was bestseller.
There you go.
It was. She had a talk show too, and I would listen to it in the car. But it was just one of those things because, and I was married very young, so to learn these things, my mom wasn't telling me these things, and so your husband is And women too. I mean, you get into a relationship to be loved and taken care of and nurtured. And if you're not getting that, if your needs aren't being met, it's, you know, like I said, you know, for my husband, it was like he was a character in my world. I was, you know, I had the kids, I was doing my thing, I was busy.
Yeah.
And he was just very much forgotten about. And I read that with that day he had that conversation with me. It's like, I'm lonely.
Yeah.
I'm like, what do you mean you're lonely? I'm right here. It's like, I'm lonely.
You're
like,
not.
You haven't,
You're not,
like, I get no attention. But I read that book and it was like, they want to be loved and they want to be taken care of. And they have that need for intimacy. And, you know, it's, we get so caught up in our worlds and our children that.
Yeah. And if you guys want to hear more about kind of the love and marriages that Greg and Alicia have talked about, we did a 3-part series on, I believe it was called Let's Talk About Love. And there is everything from marriages versus long-term relationships. I think that's when you originally brought up that book, just what goes into love, how you develop love, and how you create relationships in
work.
The way you want them.
I really enjoy, you know, Gary Chapman had a book called The 5 Love Languages. And I think it's so interesting too, because as a therapist, one of the things therapists do is they poo-poo things that are simple. I just get a kick out of it. I don't know, Gary
easy.
Chapman, blah, 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 ha, ha. It's like, whoa. I mean, that guy's done a lot more good than I'll ever do in terms of his stuff. I mean, he is brilliant, and it's super accessible. But yeah, the physical touch, if someone's love language is physical touch, the biggest concept that Gary Chapman shared that was so helpful and has been so helpful to so many people is that I give love the way I want love. Right? And so if my love language is physical touch, and mine is, and I'm always touching my wife, I'm reaching out, touching her, holding her hand, rubbing her back, you know, scratching her hair, doing all kinds of stuff. And I see you going over there.
No, because my husband and I have had this conversation. We both know our love languages. And
exactly.
Mine is not. My lowest, it's like 2% is physical touch, but he's 98% physical touch. So I'm very familiar with
that concept, you know, the idea of
getting touched.
And I remember early in our marriage, my wife would get me cards and make me lunch, which is great. I mean, I don't mind a card.
Service.
I'm not irritated
Or
about
gifts.
lunch, but acts of service and gifts aren't that far up there for me. And so it was really like challenging for both of us to say, yeah, more or less, what the hell's wrong with you? I'm doing all this nice stuff for you, and you're not particularly concerned about that.
Yeah.
What's going on?
Because that's not how you interpreted it.
Just hug me.
Yep.
Yeah.
Now, my husband and I have had this conversation because my very high are acts of service and his very low are acts of service. And his very high is physical touch and my very low. So we're almost exact opposites. But before we got married, we kind of had the conversation like, I love you and I feel most appreciated when you go out and mow the lawn. Like when you do things. I know that sounds so dumb to some people, but that's how and so I would make him lunch or I'd do all of his laundry, and he just didn't really reciprocate that to me, and vice versa for him. He's a big hugger. I don't like hugs. I don't like being hugged. So we've both had to kind of meet in the middle on them and figure out how we both feel that and how we can give each other love. But it's funny because it is a really simple concept. Like there's 5 options and you're a couple of them maybe.
And so we talk about the idea of healing from infidelity, and a lot of infidelity comes back to this idea of how have I been doing at showing up and taking care of my spouse? How have I been doing? And what'll happen is I get into the Gottmans. The Gottmans are so good. They have this thing they call negative sentiment override and positive sentiment override. My one critique of that is it's not that simple. It's not super. I wish they had like sort of an easier name for it. But negative sentiment override is the idea that, okay, say something to me, and when I listen to what you say, I think, oh, that sounds nice. Oh, cool. Or I think, well, that was kind of mean. Or I think nothing. Like you just said something to me, and it doesn't categorize in either direction. Well, here's what's really interesting. When a lot of marriages get into a space of negative sentiment override, where I have decided at a fundamental level, it's a trust issue. I don't trust that my spouse is basically a good-willed human being. I've decided this person is not for me. They are not a friend, they are a foe. And so when they say something rude, I think, sounds about right. That's about right. A bad person says bad things.
Goes in line with them.
When they say something nice, I think, what's the catch? Not taking that. And here's what's really interesting. When they say something neutral, I'm highly likely to move it down. to categorize it into a negative spot. Positive sentiment override, when a relationship is working, I am in a spot where my spouse says something nice to me and I think, yeah, sounds about right. She's great. I like her. The neutral stuff, I say, yeah, I'll bump it up. And something bad comes my way, something that hurts my feelings, and I think, well, that's really out of character. That's really strange. So whether a marriage is in positive or negative sentiment override has a ton to do with how things are going. And so my willingness to move from negative to positive sentiment override has a lot to do with how successful I am in the marriage. And so that's really a lot of what happens in recovery from infidelity is being willing to take a look, despite the fact that this son of a bitch or this bastard did all the crappy stuff he did. Well, okay, yeah, fair enough.
Yes.
And what's my part, and am I willing to address that?
Okay.
Yeah. And the challenge, of course, being if I don't address it here, and this is what I tell folks, I say, what I often tell clients who are in this situation, I say, so your marriage is over. Do you want to start a new marriage with your partner or with someone else? Wow. There's a lot less paperwork if you keep the one you got. And if you have kids, like the studies are pretty, I mean, you can divorce well, it's possible. Live within 30 minutes of home. There's a variety of things you can do to make a divorce less challenging, as unchallenging as it can be. And it's not good. The younger they are, the bigger the impact it has, and it can even have a pretty negative impact later on. So given all that, you have to start over. Where do you want to start? And if you do want to start with the person you have now, you both got to figure out a way to get into positive sentiment override relatively shortly. And there's a lot of different tools and techniques that can work for that. But that's the long and short of it is, making that decision. So,
wow.
Yeah.
There's a lot to infidelity.
It's a good one. It's a good topic.
And everyone knows someone that's gone through it on either side.
I don't know what the studies show, but I think most people have gone through it themselves on one side or the other. I think it's pretty common.
Probably.
In our lives, yeah. Well, particularly now with all the
It's
you
easy now.
wily kids with your Tinder.
I know. Well, it's so easy. Exactly. Tinder.
You push a button.
Yeah. Before you had to seek it out. Like you had
For
to go
real.
physically do something. Now you can just download an app.
Amazing.
Crazies.
That would.
I've been married since I was 17, so we had none of those options.
None of those options.
Back in the
It's hard to
olden days.
cheat back in the olden days.
Yeah.
Darn.
Of course, probably easier to get away with it back in the older days.
That's true.
because
There's no proof.
There's no cell phones. There's no,
Yeah. Maybe not but people my age. We've all seen screenshots from somebody and
just get on Facebook and somebody's going to upload something. Yeah. It's tough.
Yeah, it's a tough crowd out there.
That's crazy. Well,
anyway.
This was good. I think there's a couple different directions we could go in. I think there's a lot of avenues to explore, especially I like this because we come from so many different angles, like married early, you're newlywed, you're, right in the middle of it, still raising kids and all of that. And then we're like supposed to be empty nesters, but they keep coming back. But so I'd like to kind of jump into this a little bit more, next time if you guys are
sounds
willing
like
to
fun.
do it again.
I'll be back.
You'll be back?
I'll be back.
You have no choice. Well, for a while anyway. They're little babies.
Just a couple more weeks, actually.
Awesome. Well, good topic. Like I said, I think we'll explore some more. And you guys, thank you so much for tuning in to Power of the Mind, presented by Granite Mountain Behavioral Healthcare, Greg Struve, Marilee Mills, and Alicia. We will see you next time.
Yay.
Bye.
For information about mental health and addiction treatment, you can reach out to Granite Mountain Behavioral Healthcare online at granitemountainbhc.com. That's Granite Mountain BHC.com. Or give us a call at 877-338-6287. That's 877-338-6287. If you have a comment about this podcast or a question you'd like us to address in the podcast, you can check out the Contact Us page at my website, gregstruve.com. That's GREGSTRUV as in Victor, E as in Edward.com. This has been a Cast 11 production brought to you by Granite Mountain Behavioral Healthcare. This episode was produced by Austin Morrison. Follow Cast 11 on Facebook, Instagram, and Pinterest at Talking Glass Media.